All right, let's do a little working class audio studio tour. I know it's typically not very working class audio to talk about gear, but I guess that's the point of these videos. Back here is kind of my standing desk, quality control, extra station. I'll try to jump back to that at the end. But here's the main room. You can see a lot of GIK acoustics panels of different sizes and shapes. Some cloud stuff on the ceiling, corner traps. Back here I have a pair of PSI active bass traps. This is the older model. They have a newer one now, but it's the same concept. If you're curious, you can just use the Google and search for PSI active bass traps. For monitoring, I have some PMC 8.2 XBD. So really nice system. I upgraded this a couple years ago and I'm very happy with these PMCs. And then around that time, I added this Trinov ST2 Pro, which is a room optimizer. You know, it does room and speaker correction, which I was really skeptical of. You know, I heard SonarWorks a while ago and I thought it caused more problems than it solved and really didn't want to like the digital correction. But aside from doing EQ correction, it also does timing and phase alignment. So it really just snaps things into focus. In this room, it takes it, you know, from an A to an A+, really. I didn't want to like it, but it does it in such a transparent way, probably because it's a dedicated, this is actually a dedicated little computer that's doing it. So really, it's a nice, simple setup. So if you're skeptical about it like I was, I recommend checking out the Trinov stuff. Over here, these are the project archives. So when projects are done, they go on here. And what I like about that is with 2 power cables and 1 data cable, I can access all my old projects. You know, I don't have to go digging for old hard drives and power adapters and hoping they work. Here's the main computer. It's a Mac Pro. I know you can get chassis and add-ons for all this stuff, but I like to have all my PCI cards and my internal solid-state drives for audio right in the computer because it makes everything really fast and simple. And this is a great computer. It's the M2 Ultra version. I'm hoping maybe they do an M4 this year, but so far that's keeping up pretty nicely. I guess the heart of the studio would be this Grace M908 monitor controller. I've had the M905 in the past, which is the stereo unit. This is really designed for immersive and surround sound. But even though I'm just doing stereo, I needed more ins and outs, digital ins and outs than the M905 had. I just outgrew it, so I went with M908. What it does is it allows me to control what source I'm listening to, you know, which audio card. I have 1 dedicated for Wavelab, 1 dedicated for my analog mastering work, 1 for Qobuz, the streaming service. You know, Mac Pro is connected USB, vinyl, all this stuff. So this lets me control what I'm listening to and where I'm listening to it. I can pick the speakers, the headphones, little mono speaker. And the reason I went with this, another reason is because when I got the PMCs, everything's all digital now. So it comes digital out of Wavelab or whatever I'm listening to, stays digital through the Grace, stays digital through the Trinov and into the speakers digitally. And it doesn't become analog until it's inside the speakers. So it's a full digital monitoring path, which actually sounds really good. Super happy with it. So continuing on the monitoring situation, I also have these LCD5 headphones from Audeze. If you haven't heard Audeze headphones, I highly recommend checking them out. I use these for quality control, of course, but also they sound so good and similar to my PMCs, I can and have used them for mastering work too, especially when traveling. But you know, they sound so good that you know you can do quite a lot of work on these types of headphones with the open back and whatever design this is. The Grace has a very good headphone amp built in, but I still use the Little Labs Monitor headphone amp, that little white thing down there. And what I like about this design is, aside from sounding great, especially for really nice headphones like I have, you can bypass the gain knob on this thing, so it runs wide open, you know, full blast. And then you just control the headphone level with the same control you would use for the speakers. So I can choose headphones, and I really don't adjust the level. I keep a calibrated kind of fixed monitoring level. But point is, it's a nice, being able to bypass the gain on the headphone amp helps it integrate with an existing monitor controller very nicely, because it's basically just like another set of speakers at that point. I guess I can talk about the other converters. That silver thing is the Crane Song Head Quantum. It's a very nice digital to analog and analog to digital converter. It's my main one that I use to feed and capture the analog chain, and it's the main clock, the master clock, because it has many word clock outs to feed the other converters. But as you can see, I have some other converter choices for different flavors. Sometimes a song might sound better being captured through this Neve master bus converter because it has some saturation tools or options. So it's really just, none of these converters sound bad. It's just different choices. So another option to capture the analog chain would be this Neve converter. Over here is the dangerous stuff. I got the dangerous convert 2 for going digital to analog, and the dangerous AD plus for going analog back to digital. So again, just different converter choices. In the desk, I also have an RME ADI2 Pro FS converter, which is a smaller box. It's harder to rack mount, so it's just sitting in the desk. You can't see it, but it's also a nice option for going in and or out of the analog chain. So with my insert switcher that I'll show, the Crookwood, between that and the DAW, I can very easily select which converter is feeding the analog chain and which converter is capturing it. And sometimes it's different converters. Sometimes the RME is feeding it and the head is capturing. I can come up with all sorts of combinations. And with the DAW, I can even automate on a per song basis which one is feeding or which one is capturing the chain for each song. So if I want to change it up per song, it's something I can automate. So when I'm playing or recording that song, it switches to the right A to D. I also just ordered the Lavery Savitor, I think it's called, for another A to D option. I'm sure it's going to sound really nice. It's just not here yet. So those are the converter options for feeding and capturing the chain. I guess I'll talk about the Crookwood next. You saw the 3 units on the floor. Those are just sort of the brains of it, but this is the remote control for the Crookwood. And this is basically just a fancy patch bay. There's a handful of other brands that make mastering insert switchers, but this is a unique one because I can choose what order things go in. Most of them are in a fixed order. You can usually swap 1 or 2 inputs around, but this one, you can insert the equipment in any order, and it's very flexible like that. It has input and output gain, elliptical filter, some mid-side features, but the basic function of this is to just insert the pieces of analog gear that I want to insert and have the rest removed. So it's just a really fancy patch bay, basically, made by Crookwood, a UK company. So I guess I'll show the analog gear next. First I'll show some metering, and then we'll get to the analog gear. What you're seeing here is a Doro meter. The song must be fading out. But on the left side is whatever I'm listening to in the studio, whether it's a streaming service or something I'm working on or vinyl or whatever. The left side is what I'm working on. This must be a quiet intro. Usually it's a lot louder. It's getting there now. The right side is not working because that's the level that I'm feeding into my analog chain. So if I was doing some analog processing, you would see the right meter lighting up because that's the level going into the analog chain. And again, the left side is what I'm listening to. I have a duplicate of that right in front of me, just a different size, style meter, but it's made by Doro. So that's right in front of me for when I'm looking at the screen. And I just have an extra one over here because they don't make them anymore, and I'm stockpiling them. I even have some in the closet for when these stop working. So that's the metering. I have the Clarity M by TC Electronics. A lot of people know what that is. As far as the analog gear goes, this is the Elijah, I don't even know how to say it, I should, alpha stereo compressor. This is a very powerful unit. In fact, for some stuff, it just sounds a little bit too heavy-handed, and not so much in the compression realm, but it just has a very robust sonic imprint, so it's not right for every project. For some projects, it just sounds too much. It just sounds a little bit too thick and robust. But I use it for a fair amount of stuff, especially modern stuff. And as you can see, I'm not even using it at 100%. You can blend it in parallel. So I'm typically at about 70% and doing almost no gain reduction. With all these compressors that I'm going to show you, typically doing little to no gain reduction. It's more about color and tone shaping and maybe catching a little bit of peaks. But if I really need to manage the dynamic range of a song, the best way for me, in my opinion, is to use level automation within Wavelab, either before the analog chain or before the final limiter. That's the best way to seriously solve dynamic range problems instead of trying to just crush it with a compressor. In my opinion, the compression boxes I'm going to show you are more about color and tone and vibe, I guess. This particular one has a transformer that you can put in or out, and a lot of other stuff you can research on your own if you want. Above that is the Vertigo VSM2, a German unit. I became aware of this from the plugin version that Plugin Alliance makes. It's a very cool plugin, and it made me buy the hardware. And it's not because the plugin sounds bad, it's more about where I place it in the chain of events. If I'm doing a hybrid setup where I'm using plugins, some analog gear, and then following that with a limiter, I really want to have this unit in a certain point in the chain, so that requires it to be analog for most stuff. And what it is, it's a very subtle saturation unit. You can see it does second and third order harmonics, and you can saturate just a certain frequency band, like the low mids, the upper mids. You can do the whole spectrum if you want. And then you can dial, so you can really shape the characteristic of the saturation, and then you just blend it into taste, usually very subtly. It's not a heavy-handed thing for me. But the cool thing about the plugin is you can solo the saturation and really hear what it's doing isolated and then blend it into taste. The hardware doesn't have that feature because of the limitations of hardware. So the plugin is a great way to learn it. And honestly, I do a lot of projects all digitally now, so there's some projects where I don't use any of this stuff. And I use the plugin version quite a bit because it does sound really good. Like I said, I just got the hardware so I can have it at a certain point in the processing chain. Above that is the Rupert Neve, Master Bus Processor. I know a lot of people use this. It's a pretty common unit. I tend to not use the special effects stuff on the right side. I think it's a little gimmicky, but it's a very nice sounding unit I like to use it for rock and punk stuff, and even some modern pop that needs to sound just a little bit more aggressive and dirtier. And it's a cool unit for that. Again, doing little to no gain reduction, but just about giving us some coloration. And as you can see, I'm blending it to about 70% as well. So that's one option. And if I haven't said it already, I don't use more than one compressor. These are just all about having different color choices and different flavors. Above that is the Dangerous Bax EQ. It's just a really simple shelving and filter EQ, very utilitarian type piece. It's not there for color or anything exciting. It's just, like I said, more of a utility piece. Above that is the API 2500. It's a really heavy, in my opinion, really heavy-handed and kind of grabby compressor. So I never run songs through this 100%. What I do sometimes is, if I'm working on something and it needs a little more oomph, the Crookwit allows me to send the entire analog chain to a parallel path. So sometimes I'll insert this in parallel and just add it maybe 20% into what I'm doing, just as a little bit extra, but I don't think I've ever run an entire song through this 100%, at least not in the last 10 or 12 years, because it's just a little, I think it's more suited for like bus compression in a mix, like drums or vocals or something, but it's a little too much for mastering unless you're using it in parallel and just sneaking it in a little bit. It's got a little nice thing for certain types of music. Let's go down to the bottom of this side. This is a Mazalek MEA2 precision equalizer. It's not tubes, it's just a very nice solid state EQ. It's a very classic mastering piece. A lot of people have this. People think that, these are detented, so people think that it's for recalls, which is kind of nice for recalls, of course, but really it's about making sure the left and right channels are 100% accurate, or as accurate as they can be in the analog realm. So, I use this EQ quite a bit. It's fairly transparent. It can add a touch of warmth or reduce some harshness, but it's just a great mastering EQ to have. And, so a lot of these mastering companies are older people that make them, and the parts are getting hard to find. So these are becoming a little bit, scarce and obsolete. So I'm glad that I have one. Above that is the Mazalek MLA4. It's a multi-band compressor. It does some expansion, which I really don't ever use. If I'm going to do any expanding, it's not very often, and I typically do it with software, but I definitely like this for the multi-band features. It's nice that you can, there's a lot of features and settings, but it's just nice that you can sort of tame the lows, the mids, and the highs, individually in the analog domain. Again, if I see more than one green light coming on, that's aggressive for me. It's all about subtle taming, but this gets used on pretty much every project, whether it's barely doing anything or doing a moderate amount. It's a cool thing to have. Above that is the Mazalek MDS2, which is a stereo de-esser or high frequency limiter type thing. And I usually have this at the very end of the analog processing because it's a nice little safety net for taming some harsh S sounds that might be popping out or anything that's getting aggressive. My main de-essing these days is actually Isotope RX. I listen to each song all the way through, and S by S, if needed, I will lasso the S sound and dim it a little bit so it's not so harsh. That's, in my opinion, the best way to do de-essing these days is with Isotope RX, and I call it spot de-essing. So anytime, I don't run it on the whole song, I got to listen in real time and circle the S's, but that's the best way. But this is just nice to have, doing some gentle taming and reining into the highs when I'm in the analog realm. Above that is the Mazalek MLA2. It's a very nice, it's called the Precision Stereo Compressor, and I would say that it is pretty precise. I'm trying to think. The de-esser is the only Mazalek that doesn't have stepped, or whatever they call it, pots where it clicks. But yeah, it's just a nice de-esser a nice stereo compressor for recall and channel matching. I thought these were no longer made, but he found enough parts to make 50 more, so I bought one while you still could, because that's probably going to be the last run that's ever made before it's discontinued, so I just wanted to grab one. I don't use it a lot, but on some stuff it sounds really nice. It's very clean, very accurate, perfect for mastering. Above that is the Elysia Expressor Neo, which is a very affordable and super awesome sounding stereo compressor. Again, it has a blend knob, so I can do like less than 100%. And for the price, if someone wanted to get their first stereo mastering compressor, this would be pretty high on my suggestion list, because relatively speaking, it's pretty affordable and it sounds really great. I use it quite a bit. Sometimes when the alpha's just sounds too much, when it's too aggressive or has too much sonic imprint, oftentimes the Expressor is the perfect thing because it's a lot more neutral sounding. So that's that. Let's check out the side rack. We're getting close to the end here. Better Maker Mastering EQ. It's an analog EQ, but you can control it digitally with the plug-in. And again, a lot of people think that's for recall. I honestly think the plugin was designed from a mix engineer standpoint, unfortunately, because you can only have one plugin instance per session. And in a mastering session, you typically have all the songs in one session, kind of like I have on my screen here. There's a whole record laid out. What you can't do here is you can't put a plugin on each instance on each song, because the hardware gets confused if there's more than one plugin active. So when I'm doing my analog work, I actually use Reaper for that, because I've had so many scripts made over the years that help me work faster in Reaper. Years ago, Wavelab was not very good with the analog ins and outs. You could do it, but it was pretty crude. Now it's better. People are using it, but I'm still using Reaper because of all this special scripts I had made for when I go analog. But the main one is that in Reaper, I can tell all the plugin instances that aren't needed for that song to go offline. So only one plugin instance is active in the session. So basically what happens then is the hardware, the Better Maker, changes EQ settings for each song as I play or skip around. And I don't have to do any automation or snapshots. It's literally totally automatic. I just put a plugin instance on each song, and it changes as I move around the session. So that's how it should have been designed for mastering, but it wasn't. But anyway, that's a long story. This is a pretty good sounding EQ, and I use it a lot for mastering because of, like I mentioned, I can automate per song. So when I'm skipping around and dialing in a record, a lot of things stay the same these days in the analog realm, but the EQ can change per song very easily thanks to that Reaper script. So that's why I still use the Better Maker. Above that is the Pendulum OCL2. This is one of the few used units that I've ever purchased because, like I mentioned before, the guy that made these, I think he passed away, or maybe he retired, or both. But you can't get these new anymore, and I kind of gave up on ever finding one, but somebody was selling a pretty clean one, so I bought it, had it tuned up, and I need to use it more because it's tube. I usually have it turned off, and I don't always think to turn it on, but it's a really nice tube compressor. It's a lot faster sounding and a little cleaner than the Very-Mu, which I'll get to up there, but it's similar to the Very-Mu, the Manley Very-Mu, I should say. Above that is a tube unit that I do use fairly often, not on everything, of course, but the Whitestone P331. The original version had a white faceplate, and in my opinion, it was very subtle, like extremely subtle, to the point that other people thought the same thing, and now Whitestone makes this evil version, as you can see, EVL, and it's got a black plate on the front, so it's just got a different look. And in my opinion, it's still pretty subtle. You can push it more aggressively than the original, but it's still on the subtle side, especially with the settings you see here. And one of the great things about the design of both versions is as you drive the tubes harder with this, I can only use one hand right now, but you do both channels. As you drive the tubes harder, the output level stays the same, so you can really accurately hear what you're doing to change the tone and coloration, and without the level just going insane and you having to compensate. So that's a very cool thing they thought of when they designed it, is you can drive the tubes harder, but then the output drops down, so the level stays even. So I use this quite a bit on certain types of music. Folk Americana stuff sounds great for it. But it's not right for everything. But it's good to have a nice, I had a couple tube EQs over the years, and I found that I was just using the tube EQs flat, but just for the tube sounds. So when I heard about this unit, I thought that's perfect. It has a little bit of EQ in transformer. You can do an EQ lift. I wouldn't call it an EQ though. It has a couple options that can shift the tone and EQ a little bit, but it's basically just designed to be a tube unit to drive the tubes. It's not an EQ. So I thought this was a perfect thing, and then I actually sold my tube EQ because I wasn't using it. Above that is the Manley Stereo Very-Mu. It's a limiter, it's a compressor. They call it a limiter too, but again, with all this stuff, I'm doing very little gain reduction, so never any limiting, certainly, and actually very little compression. But this is such a classic unit. I don't use it often, but if I'm going to be doing like a traditional jazz record, especially one that was recorded digitally, but they're doing more traditional, old school jazz, I pretty much always reach for this, because when you think about those great old jazz records, they were done on tape through a lot of tube equipment with ribbon mics. So everything was really slow and thick, and just slow and thick, I guess. And, there's nothing wrong with digital recording. I'm not bashing it at all, but, digital recordings are so fast and accurate and no color, that if I'm doing a traditional jazz recording, a new one, and it needs to sound a little old and vintage, the Manley Varimu pretty much always gets used, because it helps shift things back in that direction where it sounds a little more vintage. And, I don't use it a lot on modern type music, because I just think it sounds a little too thick, and it slows things down too much. It adds a lot of weight, which can be good or bad, but basically if I'm doing traditional jazz, this thing is turned on and getting used. So that's why I still have it. I guess I'll talk about the turntable real quick, speaking of traditional jazz. This is obviously a ridiculous turntable, over-engineered. It's more of an audiophile or a reference turntable. But the reason I got it is because I listened to so many test pressings of stuff I've worked on. A lot of bands and artists don't have a turntable to check their test pressings, or if they do have a turntable, it's not very good. So sometimes they think there are problems that don't exist. Probably the biggest one being the speed. A number of times I've heard from a band that they got their test pressings and it's too fast or too slow, which is almost impossible to happen. It could happen, but it's very impossible. And the main reason for that, I think, is, when you buy a new album from some other artist, you just put it on and listen to it casually, and you accept it for what it is. When it's your own music that you've been working on for a few weeks, months, years, you're really sensitive to the original native pitch and all the timbres and stuff. So if you get a test pressing and you throw it on a cheap turntable and it's 5% fast or slow, it really grates on some people, and they think there's a problem. So I have this super duper turntable, and aside from being a great sounding turntable, it's got a nice thick platter, nice stylus, all this stuff. It's pretty advanced. But the main thing it has is it's made by VPI in New Jersey, but there's a company in Wisconsin actually called Soda, as you can see. They make this Roadrunner Condor thing, and what they do is they modify the motor so that it can be used with this stuff instead of the VPI power supply. And on the bottom of the platter, they give you a magnet. So there's a little tiny magnet on the bottom of the platter, and you can see there's a sensor back here, and the magnet goes over the sensor. So it's basically a tachometer. The motor and the Roadrunner know how fast the platter is spinning, and the power supply kind of it tells the motor to speed up and slow down to keep it right at, usually once it gets settled here, it'll be right at 33.333. So this helps it spin at the right speed. It of course does 45 RPM and even 78. But a lot of times I'll digitize test pressings for clients of mine, and they can hear how it sounds on a nicer setup, a little more accurate. You of course want to make sure it sounds good on a consumer setup, but there's some things like speed problems that you can't overcome on a consumer setup. So this is a more accurate way to listen to a test pressing. I can actually sync up the test pressing and the digital file I made. I can usually sync them up close enough where I can toggle between the two, and they stay in sync all the way to the end of the side, and that really helps me check for tonal changes, just to make sure everything is sounding good on vinyl, and of course that the speed is correct. And I was going to say one other thing and I forgot, but also it's not unheard of. There's been some projects where I have to remaster from a vinyl copy, whether it's one song or even a whole record, a couple times, because the master tapes are lost. And it's never ideal, but I've done a couple projects where I digitize digitize the vinyl. Sometimes it's a sealed copy that's never been played, but digitize that, clean it up with RX, and that's honestly the only source that exists in the world to remaster from. It's unfortunate, but it happens. But that's when it's nice to have a good turntable like this to to transcribe records for remastering. So we're pretty much near the end here. I'll show you the standing desk setup. Screensaver went in. Screensaver's on. But here's where I do a lot of RX work. Sometimes I'll analyze incoming files. I've even mastered some singles and done some mastering work on this setup because this is also my travel and mobile setup. Essentially, I take this laptop. I don't take the screen. I take the laptop, and I have another Pelican case with some Odyssey headphones and another interface. So I'm ready to go. If I need to move fast, I can grab my laptop, my mobile setup, and I'm ready to go. But this is also just here because on busy days, if the computer is busy printing a full album through the analog gear, or if I have to render along in the box record, I can do it on this setup or the other one. It's just nice to have two setups so I can multitask when the computer is tied up or just to help productivity. This setup utilizes that same RME that I talked about. It's an RME ADI2 Pro FS. Really great sounding converters, really good sounding headphone amp if you need that. At this setup, I also use the LCD5 from Odyssey. They just sound amazing. So that's the standing desk for extra stuff. Here's some vinyl, personal collection, test pressing, stuff I've worked on. The VPI record cleaner that's used as a shelf sometimes. And yeah, so thanks for watching this. Hopefully you got some entertainment and good information out of it. And thanks again for watching. And thanks to Matt for doing such a great podcast and doing these add-on videos.